You think you know African history, but what if I told you that before European colonization, Africa was home to empires so wealthy and powerful that European kings begged for their gold? Today we're diving into 5 African empires that were completely erased by colonialism, and their stories will shatter everything you thought you knew about pre-colonial Africa. Picture this. While Europe was still figuring out basic navigation, African emperors were commanding trade routes that spanned continents, building universities that attracted scholars from around the world, and amassing wealth that made European royalty look poor in comparison. These weren't small tribal communities that colonizers love to portray in their narratives. These were sophisticated civilizations with complex governments, advanced military strategies, and economic systems that would make modern economists jealous. But here's what really gets me fired up. These empires didn't just disappear because they were weak or primitive. They were systematically destroyed, their histories rewritten, and their achievements buried under centuries of colonial propaganda. The more you learn about what was actually lost, the more you realize that colonialism wasn't just about taking land and resources. It was about erasing an entire continent's legacy of greatness. Let's start with the Kingdom of Kush, and I promise you've never heard this story in any history class. Located in what's now Sudan, Kush was so powerful that it actually conquered and ruled Egypt for nearly a century. Think about that for a second. While most history books focus on Egypt as this incredible ancient civilization, they conveniently forget to mention that black African pharaohs from Kush were calling the shots in Egypt from around 750 to 650 BCE. The Kushite pharaohs, known as the Black Pharaohs, restored Egyptian temples, revived ancient traditions, and built more pyramids than any Egyptian dynasty. Their capital city of Meroe was a center of iron production and trade that connected Africa to the Mediterranean world. But when the Romans arrived, they didn't just defeat Kush militarily. They systematically destroyed Meroe's libraries, melted down artifacts, and even went so far as to deface monuments that showed black pharaohs ruling Egypt. The psychological warfare was brutal. Roman historians started writing accounts that portrayed Kushites as barbaric, even though Roman soldiers had just witnessed some of the most advanced metallurgy and architecture of the ancient world. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate campaign to erase evidence of African civilization that rivaled Rome itself. Now, let me blow your mind with the Kingdom of Axum. Located in modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, Axum was one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Yes, you heard that right. While Europe was struggling through the Dark Ages, Axum was minting its own currency, building massive stone obelisks that still stand today, and controlling trade routes between Africa, Arabia, and India. Axum's king Ezana converted to Christianity in the 4th century, making it one of the first Christian nations in the world. They had their own written script, advanced agricultural systems, and a navy that patrolled the Red Sea. But here's where the story gets tragic. When Islamic expansion reached the Red Sea region, Axum found itself cut off from its traditional trade routes. Instead of adapting and surviving like they had for centuries, external pressures combined with internal conflicts began weakening the empire. European colonizers later used this decline as evidence that African civilizations were naturally inferior, completely ignoring the fact that Axum had thrived for over 800 years and had been a major player in international commerce when European kingdoms were barely organized.
But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to the wealth and power of the Mali Empire. When Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, went on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought so much gold that he crashed the entire Mediterranean economy. The man literally caused inflation in Cairo that lasted for 12 years because he was giving away so much gold. European maps from this period show Mansa Musa sitting on a golden throne, holding a golden orb, because even European cartographers couldn't ignore Mali's wealth. Mali controlled the gold and salt trade across West Africa, and their capital city of Timbuktu housed the University of Sankore, which had a library containing over 700,000 manuscripts. Students from across Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe came to study mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and Islamic law. This was happening in the 14th century when most of Europe was still illiterate. The French colonial administration specifically targeted Timbuktu's intellectual heritage. They confiscated manuscripts, destroyed libraries, and imposed their own educational system that portrayed African knowledge as primitive superstition. Families were forced to hide ancient texts in caves and underground chambers to preserve what remained of centuries of scholarship. The Songhai Empire that followed Mali was even larger, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger River. Their military was so advanced that they used professional cavalry units and an organized navy to patrol the Niger River. The empire had a sophisticated tax system, trade regulations, and legal codes that governed commerce across West Africa. But when Moroccan forces invaded Songhai in 1591, they weren't just conquering territory. They were armed with European firearms and supported by European allies who had a vested interest in destabilizing West African trade networks. This was one of the first examples of Europeans using proxy forces to destroy African empires that threatened their emerging colonial ambitions. The final empire that haunts me is the Kingdom of Ndongo, ruled by the legendary Queen Nzinga. This woman spent 40 years fighting Portuguese colonization in what's now Angola, using guerrilla warfare tactics and diplomatic strategies that kept the Portuguese at bay for decades. She formed alliances with Dutch traders, relocated her entire kingdom to avoid Portuguese slave raids, and personally led military campaigns until she was in her 70s. Queen Nzinga understood exactly what colonization meant for her people. She witnessed Portuguese slave traders destroying communities, kidnapping her subjects, and systematically dismantling the social structures that had held her kingdom together for generations. Her resistance wasn't just about maintaining political power, it was about preserving African humanity itself. When the Portuguese finally overwhelmed Ndongo through superior firepower and by exploiting internal conflicts, they didn't just establish colonial control. They rewrote the entire narrative, portraying Queen Nzinga as a savage cannibal in their historical accounts, even though Portuguese documents from the same period describe her as an intelligent negotiator and skilled military strategist. This is what colonialism really did to Africa. It didn't just extract resources and exploit labor. It systematically erased evidence of African achievements, rewrote historical narratives to justify ongoing oppression, and convinced the world that Africa had no civilization worth preserving. The tragedy isn't just what was lost, but how thoroughly the world was convinced that nothing valuable existed in the first place. These 5 empires represent thousands of years of African innovation, wealth, and political sophistication that were deliberately destroyed and forgotten. Understanding their true stories isn't just about correcting historical records. It's about recognizing the magnitude of what colonization stole from an entire continent and why those effects still shape Africa today.
If you found this journey into the roots of the past as fascinating as I did, hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow and share these incredible stories. And to make sure you never miss another deep dive into African history, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Let's keep exploring together.